this session, we're going to talk about the basics of math. Like any other subject, it's important to understand the basics before you get started. If you're going out for a sport, you want to know the rules of the sport before you even get started. So let's talk about the basics that are underlying algebra in particular. In elementary school, we learn the basics of arithmetic. Those are quite different when we get to algebra, so let me explain it. I often ask students at the beginning of a course like this, how many rules are there in math? And I get a whole lot of answers, from 40 or 50 to hundreds. And what that tells me is that people are confused about math. They try to memorize a lot of stuff, but they don't know the real basics. The fact is there are only 5 rules on which everything else is built. We call these the axioms. When I ask people how many operations there are in algebra, classically I get the answer 4, because people are thinking about addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Well, that may have been all right with the counting numbers, because without negative numbers, if Bobby had 10 marbles and he gave away 2, we had to subtract 2. But that gets confusing when you get to algebra, because we have negative numbers, and negative numbers can take the place of subtraction. And in fact, there are only 2 operations when we get to this level. It's addition and multiplication. And you'll see in a minute where the subtraction and division come in. So let's talk about it. The first rule is called the commutative rule. It comes from the word commute, which means to reverse. So if I were to commute from home to school and later in the day go from school back to home, the distance is the same both ways. But I've reversed the operation. Both addition and multiplication are commutative, meaning that if I have 2 things and somebody gives me 3 more, I end up with the same amount as if I'd started with 3 and somebody gave me 2 more. Notice that those are 2 completely different scenarios, but the amount I end up with is the same. Multiplication is the same way. If I have 2 groups of 3 things, that's the same as having 3 groups of 2 things. We end up with 6 either way. Now you may say, well, that's really obvious. Well, I hope so, because you've been doing this for years. However, those are basic rules. The associative property. That means, that comes from the root word to associate. If we are at a party and we have a group of 3 people talking, normally one is speaking and the other 2 are listening. However, when one of the listeners comes up with something to add to the conversation, they will start speaking, and hopefully the other 2 will listen. It's the same association of 3 people, but it is changed in its order. And so I illustrate that by 2 plus 3 plus 5 is the same as 2 plus 3 plus 5. In multiplication, the same way. Notice, in addition, it's both plus signs, and in multiplication, it's both multiplication signs. The distributive property. When you think about this, you might think about playing cards, and the dealer distributes the same number of cards to each one of the players. Well, with distribution, we distribute the same quantity through multiplication to each one of the quantities that are added inside parentheses. So in this case, we have 2 times 3 plus 5. Well, that's the same as 2 times 3 plus 2 times 5. We distributed that 2 to both the 3 and the 5. And you'll hear me say later in subsequent videos, you want to make sure that the 3 and the 5, those are the 2 players, got the same number of cards, the 2. Okay? Identity. Well, we talk about identity a lot today because we're concerned about identity theft. But identity is who you are, and you don't want to be changed by somebody else. So what can we do to maintain our identity? Well, the same thing is true with numbers. So when you think about the identity law, what it says is, I have a number 2. I want to add to number 2, but I don't want to change its value. What can I add to 2 so that 2 remains identically the same? 2. 0. 0 is called then the identity for addition. Notice when we go to multiplication, something changes. If I start with the number 2, what can I multiply times 2 so that 2 does not lose its identity? The number 1. So 1 is called the identity for multiplication. Addition and multiplication have different identities. The inverse. Now this is where those other 2 operations come in, subtraction and division. If I have the number 2 and I want to get to the identity, which is 0, what can I add to 2 in order to get to 0? Negative 2. Negative 2 is then called the additive inverse of 2. Likewise, notice this. The additive inverse of negative 2 is positive 2. I want you to think about that. We'll go to multiplication. We talk about the inverse. This is where division comes in. 2 times 1/2 gives me the 1. 1/2 of 2 is 1. Well, notice that if I talk about the multiplicative inverse of 1/2, I get 2. The multiplicative inverse of 1/2 is 2 because 2 is the number you multiply times 1/2 and get 1. So in both cases, the inverse of a number is that quantity which gives you the proper identity. In addition, the inverse of a number is the number that gives you 0. In multiplication, the inverse is the number which gives you 1. And that's where division comes in. So the use of these 5 rules and 2 operations will be key to the rest of this course. If you want to see the mistake that most students end up making, it's in distribution. If you follow through statistically the mistakes that students make, they forget to distribute the 2 to the second number, or whatever it is we're distributing. When we get into letters, all these rules work exactly the way you see them, but when we substitute letters in here, we must be careful that we're using these rules properly. So that's the idea, the basics of math. As you go through this next homework assignment, you're going to be asked to identify these rules. So I would recommend that you write these down or review them until you know them. But these rules are very important. It's a shame to get further on to this course where we're studying something completely different, but make a basic mathematical mistake and get the wrong answer on your assignment or on your test. So these are very important to know.